this would be a nice, kind of like a nice little departure from what we've been doing. This is a painting of a painting. So this is already kind of like a twice abstracted kind of, piece of artwork. And what I wanted to focus on was mark making, right? Well, I actually have a list of things that I wanted to touch on. And everybody, well, Sharice, was everyone emailed the picture?
Yeah, everyone was sent the email.
Awesome. All right, cool.
And if they're just going to be filtering in.
Beautiful. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. Some of the things I want to touch on: luminosity, right? So when light is transmitted, especially through organic materials, right? There's a portion of that that kind of either penetrates the surface or shines through it, right? So just like when you hold a flashlight up to your finger and it glows red, right? The light is penetrating your skin and there's kind of like this luminous quality to it, right? So it's not like it's so we're trying to balance the opaque with the translucent, right? And we're working with those two things. And we're going to be the way we're going to approach that is by using wherever the light is hitting the objects, we're going to be using white, and anywhere where the light or the shadow shapes exist, we're going to be using either no white or as little light as possible. And the way that works is that when light hits the canvas, the white paint is opaque. So those colors will reflect much faster to your eye, whereas the translucents kind of penetrate the board, right, and bounce off of the canvas and come through, right? So you'll get this nice play of bounced light from your canvas, where the highlights will really pop and the shadows will seem much more subtle. So you have there'll be more three dimensionality at work here, just by the nature of the paints themselves, right? So we're going to discuss. So you can see the background has a lot of white, very opaque, right? I have in the light areas a lot of white, and then here you can kind of see these murky, kind of shadowy colors. Now, I wish I could really perfect the color gamut, because in person it does seem a little different. It's actually much closer to the picture. If you have your source photo up, I would actually to take a look at that as well, not just what I'm showing here, but maybe have two screens over where you can see the screen and then maybe the picture at the same time, right? Because over here, like, it seems much darker. Like, these shadows look very unified, but in actuality they are separate. Like, this is like a dark burgundy and this is a dark blue, but on the camera it seems like they're just one big shape, and that's not the case. Maybe it'll change if I zoom in a little bit. um, you can just barely make out the difference there. But in person, the colors are separate. All right. So that's why I said I think it was a good idea. I think you guys brought it up where you wanted to see the source material and not just the picture itself. But let's go into number two, mark making. Right. So being more creative and more thoughtful about how we actually lay the paint down. So there's a famous story, or like famous stories of John Singer Sargent. He was a famous portrait artist in the early 1900s. I'm pretty sure you heard of him at this point. But if you haven't, one of his claims to fame was he would stare at his subject and at the painting for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, put paint on his brush, walk up to his painting. He usually stood about 20 feet away from his painting. He would walk up to the painting and put one stroke down, and then he would stand back, and then he would do the next one. We don't have time for that, but but what we can do is be a little bit more thoughtful on how we're applying the brush strokes, right? I want you guys to have a little bit more intent when you load your brush up, right? You find your paint, you're going to place a mark, you're going to place another mark next to it, maybe one more mark, stand back and look. Okay, see how that works out. And I just want us to be a little bit more thoughtful as far as that goes. Okay, and number three, drawing versus direct painting. Okay, so before we've done like sketches. We've taken pencils and we've sketched out before what we're going to do, and then we paint over the sketch. Direct painting is, doing skipping kind of the pencil phase and going straight to the paint and kind of drawing with the paint. I feel like the drawing takes some pressure off of, painting right away, because paint doesn't dry immediately. Pencil, if you don't like it, you can immediately change it, or you could leave it and just paint over it later. Um, Pencil, if you do it too dark, sometimes does show through the paints, because the paints have, some see-through qualities to it. But I feel like once you have your pencils down, you have a pre-drawing in your mind, not just in here, but you've already committed to your memory about, how things are going to look. So I just wanted to kind of like take a quick vote in the chat. If you could say, do you want to do a pencil sketch first, or paint, go right into the painting, right? So yeah, I just wanted to get a kind of like a litmus test of the group and how you guys want to do that. And then the other important aspect is the power of neutral colors. So um, one of the things that separates, I guess, amateur artists, novice artists from, intermediate and advanced painters is the use of neutral colors. Not just like using paint straight from the tube can be kind of garish, right? I'm not sure if I'm saying that, like garish, where they look too bright, right? They don't really reflect what we're seeing in reality, or that they're too bright and the whole painting looks kind of like blown out. There's not enough subtlety. And the neutral colors, I feel like I've touched on it before, but here we're really going to focus on that. And we're going to learn how to take colors that are super bright out of the tube and either quiet them down, or really have much more subtle mixes next to each other to give us more visual contrast and more visual interest, right? So there's a lot of neutral colors playing with each other here in the pith of the apple, right in the core, right? So as you can see, these slices all represent the same fruit, but every single one of these surfaces is slightly different. Since this one is closer to the light source, this face is it's a little bit paler than this face here, this apple slice. So there's more white here than there is here. But then you flip to the other side, now it's the same fruit, it hasn't changed, but it doesn't receive direct light. So this is considered bounced light, right? And this bounced light has a much cooler quality to it, where this one is not receiving as much bounce light. So it's still the same fruit, but this slice has a much warmer, much deeper, much more luminous quality to it, right? So we're kind of giving it the effect where it seems like light is penetrating the apple somewhat here, and that's where we're getting this kind of glow. And this apple slice is kind of in between these two, right? Where it's getting a glancing bounce light effect, right? And it also has a somewhat luminous quality. So maybe the light is hitting it from the other side, and we're getting this luminous color to it. All right, we got somebody agreeing with me in the background. Okay. All right, so I'm going to check the chat. Okay, I see pencil, 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 pencil. I think the pencil sketch is helpful. Are we going to paint the background first? Yeah, actually, yeah. Once we get the, actually, I wanted to do. I'll get into it when I get there. I don't want to talk too much. I'd rather just paint and explain as we go. Ooh, we got one right to painting. We got one person ready to jump in the deep end. All right, but we did this democratically, so I think we're going to go with the sketch first. Okay. All right. So I'm going to hang my painting, and I did a little bit of different setup today. I usually do on my desktop, but today I would be painting right on the canvas. I mean, on the canvas, on my easel, and I'm using the canvas panel, and I just put some tape on the back of the canvas, and it seems to hold up pretty good. So if you're ever wondering, these canvas panels, they're very versatile. They're very thin, they're very lightweight. This would be great to take on, like if you wanted to paint outdoors, like plein air painting, you could take one of these, put it in a little case, and paint on the go. All right, so let's go to our colors. Actually, no, we're gonna go to a sketch. Sorry. Okay. All right, and let's talk about our subject here. Okay, so the format of this painting is pretty much a square, but we're working on a rectangle. So we're gonna be doing some inventive stuff, but really in actuality, we're just extending the background on the right side, on the left side, and you know, we're extending the space pretty much all the way around. We can always extend these shadows. That's not any stretch of the imagination, right? I think we could do that. Take a little bit artistic license and just add where we don't see it. And as far as the framing of it, let's see. What I want to do is actually square off our painting. So you could actually take a ruler, and I'm just using the width of the ruler, or you could use your thumb. You could space it with your thumb, right? It could be a rough line, it could be a sharp line, doesn't really matter. You can even take a book edge, right? You don't need a ruler, just anything with a straight edge. And we can mark off the outer edges, right? So that, can't even see it.
I'm sorry, Sam, what did you say? What are we marking off? An inch?
Yeah, well, I just took the width of my ruler as
Oh, okay.
as
All right.
a start. So this is kind of like the areas that we're going to be pretty much inventing on our own, right? So I lowered the exposure just so I'm drawing so lightly that the light kind of blew it out a little bit. It overexposed. So
And we're doing a horizontal landscape view, right?
right.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is, once again, this is the final product. So you can see where I kind of added some space to the sides, kind of inventively, right? And then just a little bit to the top and a little bit to the bottom. And this is going to help us like coordinate, plan out our drawing a little bit better. All right. Okay. All right. So when we look at our source material, let's see. I'm going to look from the foreground to the midground to the background, right? Because that's pretty much how it's layered. So the apple closest to us is not really obscured by anything. So this is going to be like my anchor for the drawing, right? And then every other piece of the drawing, we can build off of that shape, right? So whenever I'm looking at a painting, I kind of look for the most obvious things, like the simplest shape or the thing that is obscured the least, and then everything is built off of that. So right now I'm looking at where the I guess this must be the part where the stem comes out of, or is this the flower part? I forget. I think actually the stem comes out of this part of the apple, and this is the lower part of the apple, right? So this right here, I'm drawing in my mind a horizontal line, right, across, and I'm also thinking of a vertical line, right? So in the space that we provided for ourselves, this vertical line is about a third from the right edge that we created, right? So I'm using this point as an anchor. And if I look horizontally, it looks to be about halfway up my canvas, okay? So this is my first anchor point. And then I'm looking at how far the apple goes to the left edge, okay? So this edge here, this is easy because it's just close to the bottom. I can judge that, right? And now we're looking for these sweeping curves, this on the right side, right? It comes down kind of like a Nike swoosh, right? So you could think of it as that. But on the left side, the upper edge, it's a much more gentle slope, right? And it comes almost all the way to the edge of the canvas. So remember, vertically, we're moving a third of the canvas from the right, and we're working about halfway up the canvas. So if you guesstimate a third, so 1, 2, 3, maybe a little bit further, 1, 2, 3, yeah. So you figure right about here, right? I'm halfway up my canvas, and I'm about a third of the way up. Okay, so I'm going to do kind of a gentle curve going this way to the left, and a sweeping kind of Nike curve underneath. Okay, and if I go to check that against my picture, let's see. Yeah, it pretty much takes this lower, like if you were to split the canvas into fours and think of quadrants, right? You have your upper right, your upper left, and lower right. So the lower left portion of this canvas is the majority of this is the apple, and it kind of sneaks over into the lower right, right? So I like to often think of like in coordinate planes and that kind of thing. Just simple fractions, thirds, quarters, halves. Those are very easy numbers to work with, and we can visually kind of work that out in our mind fairly simply. Now, since I'm drawing on an angle, I feel like it's a little distorted here, so I'm going to move it over. So what I'm using is a kneaded eraser, and these are fantastic erasers because they last forever. They make zero mess. I would highly recommend that you have one or two of these on hand, and they last forever. They're very inexpensive. And again, this doesn't have to be an exact copy. Your version is going to be your version. It doesn't have to be to the millimeter, accurate. Just as long as we're in the ballpark. All right, so now for our second apple, right? So I'm thinking mid-ground. So now we have to look at this shape, right? So we have this kind of C curve, right? The apple core is on a tilt, right? We have a C curve here, and then this edge over here is a little bit more shallow than this side. We have a nice rounded sweeping curve, and here this is not quite as round on the right side. So I'm comparing this slice of the apple to this slice. So the left slice, which is this kind of murky brown, is thicker than our pale yellow slice on the right. Okay, so I'm looking at that relationship here. So this looks more like a thin kind of squished oval. This one looks more like a rounded oval. And then it's joined by this sweeping edge down here. So we could look at these in three shapes, right? This slice, the pale yellow, is one shape. The brownish slice is another shape. And then this shape over here, right, kind of looks like a trident, is the third shape. And that will create our apple slice over here. All right. So I'm looking at how far the fuzzy side of this, the tip of this apple compared to the core. So this little space here, this relationship, I'm looking for that, right? As far as determining this line here. If I look vertically straight up from this fuzzy part, I see the stem, right? So I'm kind of using our first drawing. This is going to be my anchor for this mid-ground apple. So I know the stem appears right above the fuzzy part of this apple. And I know the fuzzy part is very close in proximity to the core of this mid-ground apple. All right, so let's try to put that into place. All right, so we know that the core is right around here. We know that there's an angle. The stem appears right above the core here. All right, so I'm going to put in one shape, a nice rounded shape here. And the other side is not so round. I have a much shallower shape. Right, so I'm comparing one slice to the other slice. And I know this slice should appear smaller than this one. I'm gonna double check because it appears mine might be a little too small. So let's see. If I squint my eyes a little bit, yeah, it's maybe not quite as small. So I have two options. I could either make this a little bit smaller or this a bit bigger. So I think I'm going to make this one a little bit smaller. I tend to exaggerate that. I guess this is just knowledge over time. But I know myself. I tend to magnify things in my mind. So I'm going to reduce the size of my apple slice here. I'm going to run over it with my kneaded eraser. All right, don't worry about details like seeds, nitty gritty details. Right now, we're just doing the large shapes. And now along the bottom, I'm going to unify these two shapes. And this curve should give me that kind of like weird trident shape. Okay. And from here, we can add our stem, which is at an angle. And it's kind of like an oval or, a rounded rectangle shape at the top. And then directly to the right in this area is our leaf. Maybe I'm going to actually shorten my stem. I think I'm a little too close to the top for my taste. So if you ever were to put this in a frame, you want to give it just a little bit of buffer so that your painting, the major elements aren't really cut off. All right, so that's a little bit of like thinking for the future. Always leave just a little bit of border for a frame to kind of, some real estate for the frame. All right, and to the right, we have our stem. I mean, not stem, sorry, the leaf. Let's take a look at the leaf. All right. So we have a short little stem for the leaf. And you can see it doesn't extend very far. It's about the same size as the rounded portion, right? The top of the stem for the apple. If I look at this distance here and I compare it to the distance here, it's pretty much 1-to-1, right? Same thing. So let's do that. Let's make a 1-to-1 stem. And let's take a look at the leaf, the contour leaf of the line. So whenever we speak of contour lines, right, the outer contour line would be the actual shape of the object, right? So the other kind of line would be cross contour lines, and those are lines that kind of describe shapes. So if I don't want to confuse you guys, but say if I was to draw a line across this apple, it would go up at an angle of about 45 degrees and come down about 45 degrees. So this cross contour line would describe the angle of the apple, whereas the actual outer contour line would describe the the outward shape of the apple. Okay, so that's a little definition clarification on contour lines. So I'm looking at the leaf in two halves, right? We have the lower half and the upper half, and the things that's splitting it is this curved line right here, right? That's kind of like the vein of the main vein of the leaf. Below, we have a kind of just a sweeping curve, right? It's a very low curve. So if you look at, if you think of like the shape of a U, but if it's stretched out. And then above, we have this kind of roller coaster going down. We have a small bump here, and then a little bit of a larger bump. And our leaf comes to a nice, interesting point right here. So we have a U-shaped curve above, below, and then we have this wavy look on the top. So let's add that. What we can start with is from the stem is just a line indicating the curve of our leaf. So let's try that. So indicating the curve, it was just a slight curve, like so. And we could double check on where that ends by looking at our apple below. So the edge of the photo, right, you can see the tip of the leaf is lined up with the outer edge of the apple, okay? So we're just using a vertical line to pinpoint where that is. And if we look at mine went just a little bit further, right? But I'll know I can bring that back in. And our leaf will end right here. So that curve underneath is right here. And the curve above, we had a low curve and then a higher curve and a little point at the end. Now that leaf had some spikes to it, if you see here, but we're not going to draw those in. We're going to actually paint those in, okay? So you can see how it's not just smooth lines. There are some points to that. I feel like it would just slow us down if we tried to draw those. We're just looking for basic shapes here. We could do all the other fixings with the paint. All right, so we're going to move on to the last slice. So you can see if I did another vertical line, zoom out just a little bit, from the outermost edge of the apple. So the outermost edge is not the tip. If we go down a little bit here, you can see that this curve is the outermost edge of the apple. And if I was to do a vertical line, it does not hit the apple below it. So you could say that this apple is just a little to the left of this apple here. All right, so let's add that. Let's see where it ends. So as it comes down, the lower edge of this apple is right about here. We can see where it lines up on the apple on the right. I guess what we're going to have to be careful of, it's kind of hard. We don't have anything really to anchor it so much over here. What I want you to be conscious of is the space in between the background apple slice and the foreground. You see this space? The space in between objects, we call that the negative space. Okay, I've mentioned that in previous classes. I'm not sure who's here for the first time, so I'll just state it again. So the positive shapes are our subjects, the apple slices and the leaf. The negative shapes are the shapes created around those shapes that are unique to the canvas, right? So you make a drawing and you're always going to have negative shapes. You can use those shapes to kind of navigate your drawing as well. It's like a checks and balances. So here we could look at the space. Above, we could look at the space. You can see the top of this apple lines up just below the leaf, right? And all these negative spaces here. So you have the stem, between the stem and the background apple, you see this shape here, right? It's nice and the contrast is really bright. So you could see that shape perfectly. Here we have another shape created between the stem, the leaf, and the apple. So we have this little piece here. right? So that's a shape that you can be aware of. Right now, I'm not looking at the shadow, so I'm not paying attention to the shadow so much. I'm looking at the lower edge. I'm trying to ignore this dark patch, and I'm looking at this shape right here, right? So let's add that. Okay. So I know the outer edge of the apple, it's just outside of this apple, so I can start here. I can go upwards, and I know that it's just below, the tip of the apple is just below the leaf, right? So I'm going to just mark off this edge here. So I know the tip is slightly inward from the outer edge of the apple, and I'm looking for that negative shape. So that's that shape, right? So there was like a corner here, a sweeping curve, sweeping curve. Okay, let's double check that. Okay, that looks fairly good. Now we have this downward angle. So if we start at the left top corner of the apple slice and we move downward to the right, it has a downward slope. Okay, there is some character to it, but we can add that later after we establish this slope. So we can see the corner of the apple here matches with the corner of the mid apple slice right here. You see how they're right next to each other? It creates this V shape of negative space. All right, so we're going to use this negative space V shape to our advantage to establish where this corner is. All right, so going to the drawing. So there's a V shape right about here. So the back of this apple slice is kind of covered just a little bit by this apple slice. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a straight line going from that corner to here. Now, I know there's more character to this line, but I just wanted to establish the slope. I can then draw the outer edge after a little bit more observation. All right, how are we doing so far? Let me see some thumbs up. If everybody's getting this, we're good. All right, cool. All righty. So I'm going to share the photo again. All right. So it looks about halfway. That's where the seed lies, right? The pith of the apple. And we can see how there's this kind of this slightly upwards angle. It's kind of almost flat from the corner. There's a break. Okay, so before I even say that, simple fractions. Halfway through that line. So we're thinking of that straight line. Halfway is where the seed lies, right? So let's mark that off. Halfway, I'm going to guesstimate, is right about here. So our seed exists right there. Back to the photo. Now I'm only looking at the top half. So I'm looking from the corner of the apple slice to the seed. I'm looking for a break in those lines. So about halfway, we have our first break, and then there's a line coming downwards towards the seeds, and then a sharper line coming down. So there's 3 lines. So it's almost straight. You break there, you angle down, stop there, and then angle again. So there's 3 lines. 1, 2, 3. Let's add that. So we have almost flat, angling down, and then a sharper angle. Let's do the second half. So from the bottom of the seed here, we have another line that's almost flat. So it looks to me like there's 2 breaks here. We have one line breaks at this corner and then goes down to the corner. So 1, 2. Let's add that. 1, 2. And this flat spot in the middle is where the seed goes in. All right, and that's how much that's pretty much how I approach a lot of my drawings, almost all of them. I try to find something I can anchor everything else to. I break things down into either coordinate planes or just simple vertical and horizontal lines, see what matches up. Right now I'm just cleaning up some lines. Eventually with the paint, I'll be able to finalize, my drawing, but this is just to get something on the board here. All right, if we want to go back and fill in just a little bit more information. So our apple here, this one, especially in the front, is very nondescript. So let's see how we can get some information. Okay, the pale yellow face, I'm looking at the the foreground apple, the one closest to us. This slice appears much larger than the other slice, right? It's turning away in perspective, so this appears smaller, right? So I usually do my bold trick at this point. It becomes more of an oval and it gets smaller and smaller until it disappears, right? Small oval until it opens up. Oh. All right, I think we're back. I think my internet was a little messed up there. So when you're looking at something square on, it looks much more open and larger. As it turns away in space, it gets smaller. All right, so I think that's what's happening in the photo. If we think of these, let's think of these apple slices as perfect, right? So this slice appears larger than this one because this slice is turning away in space. So we have this angle here from the fuzzy part, this kind of angle coming down towards the middle. All we have to remember is that this side has to appear larger than the left side, all right, or the upper side. Let's try it. So from this here, we come at, let's call it a 45-degree angle, right? So splitting it at a 45-degree angle, meaning this is our flat side, right? Remember our what do they call compasses? Right, so here is flat, and this angle, right? If this is 90, this would be about 45-degree angle. That's how I came up with that angle. I'm always working off flat, horizontal lines when coming up with angles. All right, so now we can kind of draw the shape of our apple slice, and to help us do that, let's look at the shape of the red. Right, so the shape of the apple slice, it's like a puzzle piece, right? We want to be conscious of the red portion of the apple. We want to create this shape. We're going to create the shape by making the shapes of the apple slices, if that makes sense. So once we draw these, it automatically makes this shape. So we have to look at this shape, keep that in mind, or refer to it, but while creating the apple slice shape. All right, so let's give it a shot. So I know there's a big sweeping round kind of slice like this. And on the other side, we have something like that. Okay, so I'm checking my sizes. So I see that this slice is wider than this slice. I'm going to double check the shape of the apple over here. All right, I think we pretty much have that. However, there's a flatness to this edge here, right? Which I have, it's very rounded on my side. So you can see how this comes out really rounded, almost like a teardrop, whereas in the painting, it's a little bit flatter. And I think that's kind of reminiscent of the Macintosh apples. They kind of have a broad, like, upper part of the apple, and it has these big wavy, spots. Some of them are rounded, and this must be the dip in between the rounded edges. I know my apples. I'm a connoisseur of apples. I love apples. Apples and peanut butter, anybody? It's my go-to snack. All right. All right, so I think that works well. And we'll look at the last apple slice up here. Let's put a little bit of information up there. All right, so you can see how it's mostly sliced. We have a very small profile of skin, the red skin, and then a very thin profile of the core also. All right, so that shouldn't be too hard. So from this break right here, so remember we split this apple in half, right? This line, this edge, we split that in half, and we have 3 breaks. So starting from the second break, so this is 1 break, 2 breaks right here. We're going to draw another line coming downwards next to it, a line defining kind of like this, where the just underneath the seed, and then we're going to follow that along, leaving this a bit of space, right? And then we're going to come down here, and we're just kind of going to mirror the outer edge of the apple. Let's see if we can pull that off. Okay, so here's the first break, second break. From here, I'm going to come down. This is where the seed lies, and then I'm just going to kind of follow the edge of the apple like so. Okay. Go back to the drawing and let's look at these cores, right? So this one is facing us pretty much dead on, right? Not 100%, right? Because we do have one slice that's thinner than the other one if we're thinking of symmetrical slices. But the apple core itself, it seems very circular, and we have 2 seeds in the middle. So we're going to work with this circular kind of shape here. And if we think of the beginning of the apple core here to the end, the seed area seems a little bit lower. It seems a little bit closer to the bottom of this run right here. So I'm looking from this point down to this point, and this circle is closer to the end point below. Same thing on this side. This one seems more elliptical, right? It's more of an oval, but it's further away from this part, and it's closer to this part right here. So we're going to draw this ellipse closer to the end point of the middle of the apple. Let's give that a go. So we just want to be consistent of where that goes. So I'm going to draw a circle here. That's too low. Circle there. And an ellipse right here. All right. And I'm just going to create a little bit of space for our core to live in. So I did 2 parallel lines leading towards the seed area, another 2 lines there, just so it's not this sharp edge, right? It's not a single edge. There's actually some thickness to that area. And I want us to have a visual, whatchamacallit, kind of like a visual anchor for, how things are going to look later. There will be a certain amount of thickness of paint covering that core. So putting one single pencil line is kind of like a disservice. So in our minds, I want to create some real estate for our paint to go into, and that's where a lot of our neutral paints are going to go. Right. You could draw the end of the apple like that, that weird flowery part that exists. And then we should be ready for some paint. Well, if you want to put in the seeds, right? If you feel more confident with drawing in the seeds, here they're pretty much side by side on the mid apple. here they're off centered and they're at an angle. So the angle of the seeds follows the angle of the line. What you don't want to do is draw an oval going upwards, right? As opposed to this angled line here. So the seeds are at about a 45-degree angle. The left seed it appears larger than the other seed because it's also at an angle, right? So if you think of my hands as the seeds, you have one seed like this and then one seed like this. Okay, so you can see how my hand, they're both the same size, but since it's turned in space, it appears smaller. So our seed on the left at a 45-degree angle following the line. And then our other seed is a little off center and it appears thinner. But you can see as now that you're drawing, it's very small. And I guess it's good, another visual anchor for us later. And over here, our seeds are pretty much the same size and they're right next to each other. Something like that. And the apple seed over here is, we only see one side and it is an ellipse that kind of lays in that kind of cradle right here that we created for it. All right. So as far as the drawing aspect of this, how does everybody feel? Were the directions clear? Did it help you guys figure out what to do? Dina, you have a question? I see your hand raised. No, okay.
That was supposed to be a thumbs up.
Okay. All right, cool.
I think it was a good investment in time.
Good.
I can't imagine trying to do that with the paint directly.
Right. So whenever I do live painting sessions, I usually come in with a pre-drawn canvas, just for that purpose, because I want people to have fun with the painting and not get stressed, keep stress levels down with the drawing, because not everybody is a strong draftsman. The paint is the fun part. The drawing can
I
be
also
daunting.
threw in the shadow. I drew
Yeah.
the upper shadow, just a line there to.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever you're comfortable with. Actually, you know what? I'll follow suit. So if you want to draw in the shadow shapes, right? So again, we're just looking at negative shapes. So I guess one of the more prominent shadows is the upper slice. I think that's the largest shadow. So if we look at that guy, you can see how this shadow shape is the largest compared to the other two. So the shadow begins right here in this kind of corner where the upper slice meets the middle slice, and it sweeps downward very, very gently. It's not a sharp, it doesn't come down at a sharp angle, maybe about 45 degrees, and it almost goes vertically off to the edge. Now, we're going to have to be a little bit inventive here. The shadow ends somewhere, right? It doesn't go on forever because it's just not that kind of lighting setup. So you can almost imagine the end of an ellipse over here, and we'll add that in. It should go beyond the edge of the apple. It shouldn't come to an abrupt halt. It should be a nice thin like oval shape. So down between, we'll start at the corner here. It looks like it splits this area pretty evenly. We're gonna go pretty much horizontal at this point.
Wow,
And then,
hi.
hello. And we'll end that shadow, something like that. Now, the shadow shape doesn't exactly mirror this upper edge, but that's kind of hard too. So if you want to mirror this edge over here to more exactly, fit that profile, it would be kind of like a mirror image of that. So it's a flat line, downward, another break, All right, so it's pretty much the reverse order of what we drew above. And that would more accurately capture the shape of this shadow, right? So just like butterfly wings, right? You have mirror images. So you have one profile here, you would do the mirror image in a more stretched, kind of dramatic, shadowy kind of way. And that's how you get there. The other shadow shapes, they just lead from the edge of the apple. This shadow meets this apple here. And let me double check. And the other shadow shape leads from the bottom of this apple, like so, and from this edge, like that. My pencil's getting a little messy. And if you're wondering, do I draw a lot of my paintings before I paint? The answer is yes. So I rarely dive into a painting, and that's from experience because I have painted, at one go, just dive in, and it led to disastrous results. So for representational art, it's not a bad idea to do pencil drawings. Now, if you're a master draftsman and you can go, I know there's tons of artists who go straight into the painting. That's fine as well. It's what you feel comfortable with, I feel. And I've always felt more comfortable with pencil in my hand. All right, so from Rima, yes, this definitely helped. Thank you, especially with the measurements. Cool. All right. All right, so now let's get on to phase 2, which is paint. All right, so I'm not sure what you guys got in your brush packets, but did anybody get palette knives inside your brush packet? No, well, these are like okay,
No.
so I know some brush packets do come with them. If you guys ever come across these are a great investment. They're very cheap. They're plastic. There are metal versions, which are like anywhere from $10, to $15, which it's kind of fancy. But these are like, you can get 4 for $1, and they usually come in lots of different shapes. So if you ever come across these are a lot more efficient at mixing the paint, right? So when you're mixing paint with brushes, the brush is soaking up half the paint that you mix, right? So you kind of have a better idea of how much paint you have mixed when you have a palette knife, because no paint is supposed to remain on this, or very little, right? So it keeps the paint on the palette rather than, putting it in the brush, and then when you go to wash off the brush, you lose a portion of that paint that you mixed, right? So for now, since you guys don't have them, I won't use these, but for going in the future, or going forward, if you guys find these, they come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes, and they even have variety packs. You can buy them in a variety pack. I did not check Amazon. I'm pretty sure Amazon, you can find pretty much anything. I'm pretty sure they'll have these, but any of your local art stores, if you want to support them, I'm pretty sure they have them as well. All right, so for colors, so we're going with the primary colors again. I'll switch overhead. And I like to separate my warms and cools. So in my left corner, since I am righty, I mostly approach my palette from the right. So I'm going to do kind of like a angle like this. So I use the left side vertically and the upper side horizontally. So I have my white, and then I go in order of strength. So I have my yellow, I have my red. If I was using magenta or purple, it would go here. Or sometimes if I had magenta, I would actually have it in between the yellow and the pink, the yellow and the red. I would have magenta, and then red would be here. And then on the left side, I have my green. And I'm putting down, if you look at my thumb, I could probably use less and then just add more as I go. Because the more paint that you lay down, the more of it that will dry on the palette. And sometimes you'll form that skin and you'll actually use more paint than you really need to. Then I have my blue. This is my phthalo blue. Yeah, so if we were talking about colors, I believe this is primary red, primary yellow, green oxide, phthalo blue. Phthalo is PHT, phthalo. And then I'll have, last but not least, I'll have my black down here. And very little black. I usually hold off on black as much as possible, although it is useful in places, but overall, I like to mix my dark colors from the colors provided. They tend to be more lively, whereas the black tends to really neutralize and deaden color, unless it really calls for that. Yeah, black can be a little bit troublesome. Somebody in the chat, let's see. Can you use a plastic knife from takeout? I don't know. It's because these edges are smooth, right? You can see how there's, they're very thin, so they do give. There's some flexibility. The plastic knives from the takeout, I don't think you'll have a fine motor movement as you can with these. So these are meant to be, they're meant to give and flex. Because as you're mixing, right, you also want to wipe the paint off and maybe even use both sides. Whereas the other knife is pretty much straight handle. I do have some flat knives, but I feel like for mixing, small amounts of paint, having the neck helps with that. I can just use, the tip. And then if some paint does curl around to the top, I can flip it over and then wipe that off as well. However, I'm all for experimentation. I know I'm like flip-flopping all over the place, but I don't like to discourage people from trying things out. Okay. Okay, so from the get-go, I would like to, what I did with this painting was an underpainting. I feel like since the painting is somewhat simple, right, in its composition, we can afford to do an underpainting, meaning that we could always come over the top and then, paint that later. So with the underpainting, it's going to be one solid color. In this case, it's going to be orange. We're going to mix that. We're going to make orange with the yellow and the red, and we're going to cover the entire canvas. The pencils will come through, so you're not going to be painting over your pencils entirely. But what that gives us is a nice warm ground for us to paint over. So if you can see how when I painted with all my light colors, there is still some of that background that comes out, and that gives it a nice texture, and it gives it a good, vibrant quality where the colors look like they're playing with the orange. And it's not just that white background. We get to knock off that white. What I like to do is transform the entire canvas as much as possible. I don't want any of the canvas to show through, this painting or any painting that I did. So let's go back to here. So we're going to be using the, so I have my bucket of water. First thing I do is wet my brushes. You can see the air bubbles coming out. Air bubbles, right? A dry brush is kind of like a sticky brush. Your paint will not flow off of the brush. However, a soaking wet brush is not good either. We don't want runny paint. Okay, so after I scrape my brush off the edge of the cup, I just kind of do a couple of dabs on my paper towel, or in this case, rag. My rags are always damp as well. It helps to take the paint off, and they're easier to clean afterwards. So this rag is a couple of years old. It does stain. However, the paint won't cake on. If you did this with a dry rag, the paint would dry into the rag and it becomes hard and it loses its quality over time. Although rags are very cheap and easy to find. All right, so I'm going to grab yellow first. I'm going to tap 3 times on each side. Tap, 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 tap. I try to stay on the edge to preserve the reservoir of paint, right? Our paint puddles, always take paint from the edge. And I'm just going to make a little bit of space here. I'm going to tap off some of that paint. I'm not going to clean my brush. I'm going to go right into the red. However, you're not going to load it the same way. Red is much more powerful than yellow. Yellow is like cellophane, right? You could already see I'm working on a palette paper that's 50-50 gray, and you can see how the gray is already changing the nature of the yellow, right? It's mixing with the background. So yellow is like cellophane, very translucent. With the red, it's a bit more opaque, right? So we only need a little bit of red to really change the nature of it. Now, the amount of paint that I did was not much. You can see how thin it got. It almost looks green because it's mixing with the gray of the background. Most of that paint now is in my brush. So if I go to my canvas and I paint my canvas, you can see how I barely got 1 quadrant of my canvas done with that, right? And if I go to my palette, it's almost gone. So this is why I was suggesting the palette knife, where you can mix a nice reservoir of orange, right? And not have to constantly remix it, because your brush will soak it up. Just remember the formula. If your paint varies in color from section to section, that's fine. It'll only vary a little amount, and still be very interesting in the end. So I'm using a synthetic brush. However, it's meant to mimic the natural bristle brushes. So this is a very coarse brush, right? If you look at the bristles, they are plastic, right? They're not real, but they're meant to mimic a kind of like a natural bristle. This is like a cheap paintbrush, but these use those natural bristles. Or this is a natural bristle brush. Whenever I'm doing my
Quick question.
yeah.
It seems like once the paint is on the canvas, it's a little bit translucent, so it shouldn't be so opaque. Maybe add water or?
No, it should be translucent at this point.
Oh, okay.
All we're doing is knocking down the white of the canvas. This is called the underpainting.
Okay.
Right, so going back to the brushes, this is a natural bristle. I think most of you guys are working with the synthetic. So these are acrylic brushes, bristles. So these are kind of like a plasticky bristle. So the same thing that's kind of like in your paint, the acrylic paints, they also make the bristles out of them. They're kind of plastic. And these lay down very, very smoothly. And to me, they're not as, good at spreading the paint initially. Sometimes you just need a big rough brush to push that paint around. Whereas the synthetics, they put it down so thinly, it dries very quickly. So if you're looking for brushes to invest in the future, I would have 2 sets. I have my natural bristle set, and then I have my synthetic set. The synthetic I usually use for my second and third layers. And then for my initial layer, my first laying like this, is I use my natural bristle brushes. They're meant to push that paint around.
I'm seeing my guideline on the 2 sides. Is that
Yeah.
is that
That's fine.
still that's going to end up getting covered?
Yeah, we got about another 2 or 3 layers to go. If you want to give yourself a little bit of room, well, if it's not too late, you could. I don't know if you saw me. I was taking my kneaded eraser, and I was kind of knocking down that line a little bit. Like I still
Yeah.
have mine there, but eventually they will get covered up, because we're going to be using white for the background, and white is opaque.
Okay.
So I already had to dole out a little bit more yellow. Yellow is just like white, is one of those colors that tend to get used a lot, just because of its nature. It's a little bit weaker, and you just need more of it. And it's so versatile with making colors. You can make, greens and oranges. I mix it all the time with all my other colors. So it's one of the colors that I just go through the most. So we want this to go as thinly as possible because we want it to dry so we can paint over it. You know you're done when you don't see any more white on the canvas. One of the things I mentioned to Sharisa between our last session and this session was the idea of doing a two-part painting. So that would be a painting done in 2 sessions rather than 1 session, because there is another painting that I had in mind that I wanted to do. However, just the complexity of it, although it's another still life, the complexity of it, I think, would demand more time. So I'll show you in a second while you guys are doing that. Let me pull it up really quick.
So did you say that the natural bristles are more effective for the undercoat?
Yeah, for the first lay-in, they push the paint around easier because they're just rougher brushes. They're built for that.
Thank you.
All right. So if you look on your screen now, this is the painting that I was very interested in. It just looks like there's so much going on. The colors are so vibrant. I'm thinking spring. I'm thinking like, great colors. And I have done a lot of landscapes in the past. And the thing with landscapes is you get to fudge so much detail, with all these paint techniques. You can make, a lot of effects with simple techniques, but this requires a little bit more thought process, a lot more preparation. And there's a lot of things going on here. There's form shadow, there's cast shadow, right? We have multiple colors, we have a lot of blending, we have multiple textures, you have cloth, fruit, bowl, plant, and then the background. So I love the colors, I love the interplay of light. I love the composition, and I think it's very attractive. I would hang this in my house in a heartbeat. But I was trying to go over in my head. I did a drawing of it, a preliminary drawing. If I can find that for you guys.
Yeah, the linen towel. Wow, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I would simplify some of it. I would not try to do the whole thing. I can't find my preliminary, but I did a drawing of it to kind of, play out how it would go in a. I usually do a 3-inch by 4-inch drawing of everything that I do, and it just dawned on me the complexity of what's going on here. There's no way I could do this in 3 hours. So we were going to kind of ask and get like poll you guys, so to speak, and see what you thought about possibly doing it in 2 sessions. But it's like well, I think since things are recorded, if you attended one and maybe didn't attend the other, you could go to the recording and finish it on your own time. That's an option. But yeah, it would definitely take 2 sessions, and it's the first time I would have done something in 2 sessions. So I'm also kind of curious to see how that might work out. Dina says 2 sessions, good. So I don't know if that's too much.
Well, I, for one, think it sounds great.
Awesome. All right, so let's look at the time. It is 2:16. How's everybody doing with the background? Now, at some point, you have to leave the background alone, and we have to stop that like licking effect. You can see how mine is kind of blotchy, and that's fine. Most of it's going to get covered. It's not really, the smoothness of the paint is not dependent on the end product. We just want to get rid of all the white. That's what we're trying to do.
Brush strokes, seeing your brush strokes doesn't matter.
Nope.
Excellent.
You can see my brush strokes. They're all over the place. It's totally fine. We're doing a painting. That's kind of the fun part of this. So, like I said, mark making. That's one of our points for this painting. We want to be able to see brush strokes. All right. We want to have more intent and as an experiment, right? If you're used to smoothing everything out, maybe this is the time to depart from that. Or if you really love mark making, this is the time to really revel in that. All right. And my paint is almost dry to the touch. It's a little sticky. This is the last part I painted. This is the first part. The first part is pretty much dry to the touch. And over here is just a little tacky. What you don't want to do is a second layer. This is a one and done. If you try to do 2 layers, you're going to reactivate the paint and possibly rip it off. And then you're going to get bright spots. You're going to get hot spots. So that means where you should have one, if you're trying to do a second, you're going to rip off the first one, and the second one's going to be considered your first one. So the surrounding paint is going to have 2 layers, and that hotspot is only going to have 1. Does that make sense? It's like kind of like almost like ripping off a scab and then, covering it over again. You have multiple layers and then only down to 1 layer. So just try to get it covered and leave it done. This is the simplest part. Don't overthink it. Just get the yellowish orangey color, and we should be fine. If you want, after that, we can take maybe like a 3-minute break. I suggest you put down your brushes, let it dry. If you want to refresh your coffee, my coffee's cold. I'm going to go microwave it real quick, and we can come back no later than 2:25. We'll get going again. Okay? All right. Brushes down. Trust me. If you keep painting, you're going to get in trouble. Not by me.
Okay.
All right. I'll be right back. Good.
The break is good timing, Sam,
Yeah, why is that?
because I see the canvas, it's still drying.
Yes, a sticky canvas could be problematic because number one, we could actually rip off the underpainting, or the colors that are still wet, they will mix with the colors that we put on top, which is really not our intent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's
You
why I
think-
said put it on nice and thinly because it'll
Yeah.
dry fairly quickly.
You-
Now mine is dry.
So if it's not, should I grab a hair dryer?
Sure, that's a great idea.
Okay.
All right, let's see. All right, it is 2:25. I'm gonna jump back in here. Now, well, the first thing I wanted to talk about is at no point in this painting will you see any white, right? So I know you see a lot of light tones, but there is no plain white paint here. Everything has a certain amount of color to it. And so just remember that whenever you're not gonna do plain white from the tube, right? It's very rarely that there's anything that's just plain white. There's always like, even with that other picture that I posted, right? Let's see, the oranges. So all of these whites here that you see, they're actually tones of gray, and you can see all kinds of different colors in those whites. Like this white is kind of like a warm white. Very few places have bright or plain white, and that's also usually the difference between some amateur paints and some more advanced painters. Their ability to see neutrals and use those colors effectively. Um, we rarely use paint straight from the tube. I wouldn't say you can't do that. I'll never say you can't do something, right? If you feel like that's what you want to do, that's fine. Actually, one of my favorite painters, Jean-Michel Basquiat, he was a young guy in the early 80s. He was like very into street art, very abstract. He was kind of friends with Andy Warhol and that crowd. And he would take tubes of paint and he would, he would take tubes of paint and he would take the tube and just hold it up directly to the canvas and just paint with the tube. He would do all kinds of crazy stuff. So I mean, depending on what you want to do, but as far as this representational painting, we're not going to use straight from the tube paint, right? So I am going to switch my brush. Now, you could use the same brush that we use, right? It depends on your familiarity with this brush. If you are comfortable with this brush and you can feel like you can get in tight places, you can go about with this brush. If you need a slightly smaller brush, because now we're going to be going around the shapes that we drew, okay? So we're going to be putting in the background, and we're going to be moving from like a bright area down to a darker area, and it's not an obvious kind of move. It's very subtle. So you can see there's the brighter tones are at the top, and as you descend towards the bottom of the canvas, they do get slightly darker. What I want you guys to notice is the amount of mark making is. You don't have to smooth it out. All right, we're not about smoothing it out so much this painting. We want our marks to be just as much a part of the painting as the apples are. Okay, so
Oh, Sam,
yes.
question about when you're referring to the use of neutrals, are you talking about the blending of like the blue tone
Yeah, we're going to
into one of the slices and
we're going to get into that right now. So
okay.
think of like the pure tone is the pure color is right from the tube, right? Anytime you adjust that color, it becomes like a neutral, it becomes to be neutralized, right? So in this particular case, I'm also talking about complementary colors. So if we look at the color wheel, which is on the back, so this is my palette paper, right? That's this waxy kind of paper here. If you look at the cover here, is it upside down? Yes. Okay, so we have our color wheel and we look at our complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors that are directly across from each other on the color wheel. Anytime you mix any of these colors, you do get a grayish kind of version of that, right? So if you have a bright garish red, like it's super bright and you need to quiet it down, you need to neutralize the brightness of that color, you look to its complementary and you add some of that to the complementary.
Oh, okay.
And you'll get a quieter version of that color.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I misinterpreted. I thought you meant neutral colors, but you meant neutralizing combinations.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank
So,
you.
like if you're thinking like painting a house and you think of neutrals, you're thinking like grays and that kind of stuff. And that is a part of it, but neutralizing a color doesn't always have to be a gray. All right, so I'm going to switch to a medium-sized brush. I'm going to make sure it's wet, so I'm putting in my water cup. Right, I am scraping out the excess water, and then I'm wiping it on my paper towel or my rag in this case, and we should be good to go. So for the color that we're going for, it's going to be a mixture of white and blue. Now, when you mix white and plain blue, you will get a kind of like an electric light blue. So I'm going to pick up white, load it up, and I'm going to pick up just a little bit of blue, right? Because blue is a very strong pigment. I'm going to mix that up, and immediately you'll get a light kind of like baby blue. Now, what I want to add, what I want to do is kind of like neutralize this color. The opposite of blue on the color wheel is orange, right? That's its complementary, but we don't have orange, right? So to speak. We could mix it, but that'll just slow us down a little bit. So I'm just going to go and grab just a little dab of red. Now, red in this case, my sneaking suspicion is that these reds aren't pure reds, meaning that they're probably mixtures of yellows and magentas to get a red. There are some reds like cadmium reds that are just red by nature. The pigment, the color of the pigment in the binder, the acrylic binder, which is a clear binder, is pure red, right? That's the difference between professional paints and like student paints. It's the amount of pigment and the quality of the pigment. So these could be mixtures of a number of paints, whereas the more professional paints, you get better pigments. So I feel like there's yellows inside of these reds. So this is a little bit, it's kind of like just like a really dark orange. And when you add that to this blue-white mixture, right? All right, mine went a little too red, but you can see it starts to look pretty neutral, right? You're not going to get that baby blue color anymore. You're going to get a kind of like a soft gray. Okay. So we no longer have a baby blue. Now, I'm trying to get it the light. So you can see it's not pure white. It's not baby blue, and it's also not lavender. It's not blue. I mean, it's not purple. So remember, it's mostly white, a touch of blue, and a touch of red. And if it's too warm, meaning if it looks closer to the purple sides, add just a touch of a tinge of blue. And then if it starts to look more purplish, like too dark, add a ton of more white. We want it very, very pale. As you can see, it's almost white here. Now, as we descend through the painting, I'm going to use this very bright one color at the top of the painting. As I descend, I can add a little bit more of the blue and red to make this a deeper grayish color. Okay, so there's going to be a gradient. From the top, we're going to start bright, and then as we work our way down, it's going to get gradually darker. So as you're mixing new paints, right, you might want to leave maybe just a little dot as a reminder. It's like, okay, this is where I started out with it. And as you mix more paint, keep adding dots to show that you're getting progressively darker. All right, because sometimes if we mix on top of where we're mixing, we lose the original color that we worked with, and we kind of lose our way. So this would be like, Hansel and Gretel through the forest, leaving breadcrumbs. So leave yourself some breadcrumbs. It's like, okay, this is where I started, and keep leaving yourself breadcrumbs to show you how you're progressing through your paints. That's like a little tip. Okay. All right, let's start. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top. Now, if some of your paint, yellow paint shows through that underpainting, don't worry about it. Okay, so I'm not caking on my paint. It's actually going on fairly thin at this point, but the opacity of white is pretty high, meaning it's a pretty solid paint. All right, and I'm making my way across. I want the top portion to be one solid color, right? So I'm working my way from left to right, and then I'll start again left to right, and then I'll work my way again left to right. Each zone getting a little bit darker as I go down. All right, so you're going to paint the entire background. Now, if you want to double check, you guys have the image. I'm going to keep my painting up here, but if you have the image opened up on your computer, you can take a look at how you're progressing. Mixing paint. I'm trying to be as careful as possible, but if I do get paint over my pencils, right? If I start sneaking up onto the apples at all, the stem, the leaf, I'm not too worried about that either, because our future layers are going to go over that, and we should be just fine. It's when you don't have the paint meet up, right? If you don't paint up to the pencil lines, you're going to get a halo around everything. So do not fear losing your pencils. The whole idea of doing the pencils was not only to, figure out what the paint is going to look like, but also to put a picture in our mind of what things are supposed to look like. So if they do get covered up, you'll be able to do it again. If you did it once, you should be able to do it again. I don't want you to have that fear of losing your drawing. That's actually one of those things that beginner painters need to build their confidence on. If they don't have strong draftsman skills, they get scared of losing their They're drawings where if you build those skills, if you have those fundamentals, you'll be able to redraw it, but just with the paint. All right. So now I've pretty much finished the top area that has, the brightest amount of paint. I'm going to go to the mid area. I'm going to squeeze in this little section here. Oh, something else to note. When your paints are wet, they appear brighter than they do when they're fully dry. So when your paint's dry, they'll actually dry maybe like half a tone, half a shade darker. Right? It won't be really obvious, but sometimes you'll mix new paint and you'll put it next to the dry stuff and you're like, oh man, why does it look so different? I mixed it just like I did before. It's because the paint is wet and the other paint is dry. So they look darker than one another, or they look like they're different shades. Sometimes you'll mix a color that looks exactly like the dry color. When you put it wet, it looks exactly like it. You're like, oh man, I mixed it just right. And when it dries, it looks darker than the other paint, right? And that's because of that fact that paints, when they dry, they get just a little bit darker. So if you mix a color that's wet that looks exactly like the dry, you can pretty much bet that paint is going to be darker when it dries than that other paint. So when they're both dry, they're going to look different. So try to, if you're painting areas that you want to look the same, if it's dry and your paint is a slightly bit lighter than the paint that you have next to it, you're probably on the right track, right? So that's just one of those annoying facts about, paint. No matter how good you get at color matching, you kind of always have to wrestle that inequality. Okay, and as I approach my last section here, the bottom corner, you can see how the paint looks darker than the top portion there. Right, you can see it's very subtle, but as I'm dropping, this was my brightest areas, and then as I came down, these are my darkest areas. On the original painting, I'm kind of thinking there's probably a little bit of black in the paint.
Hey, is everyone still doing okay?
Yeah, everybody's in the zone right now.
No, I'm just asking because I just got kicked off for a second. So
Oh, you did?
yeah, I thought the
Oh, wow.
meeting dropped for a second. Just making sure.
All
right.
On my side, everything's cool.
Sounds good.
I think, yeah, I think we're good.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Yeah. I was like, oh no. Okay. Back to the zone, guys.
So Sam, what I find really interesting in this segment is to see how the under layer of the yellow shows through.
Yeah. So that's one of those qualities in like museum paintings that you're seeing, but you really don't know the story behind it. A lot of the times there's an underpainting, and it really allows for these amazing, color relationships to happen almost accidentally. All right, I think I'm happy with that for now. Something else that we can do next that's fairly simple is add in those shadow shapes. That's another nice thing of having the pencil lines is you know exactly where everything is supposed to go. And you just need to mix the paint and apply it. So I think I'm going to continue with my, well, how many people are still working on the background? Okay, I'll give it.
Oh, yeah.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
On mine, my white doesn't really cover all the yellowish. Do I need to do another layer?
Not right now.
Okay.
Right now, this is still kind of like the mid painting. Right, so if you want to think of painting in phases, right, you have the underpainting, then you have the initial laying of paint, and then you have your second layer, or your final layer, your final
it's fine.
meaning.
Need a little of yellowish, like.
Oh yeah, I have yellow popping out everywhere in my painting. I can see.
All right, okay,
That's
got you.
that's kind of like that's kind of like what we want to have. We don't want to get rid of that effect, so to speak.
All right, thanks.
No problem. That's that part of the painting that we're working on, that luminosity. This is kind of like our first foray into how to make colors really pop and vibrate and do all kinds of fun stuff.
Mom,
Uh-huh.
you're not
Yeah.
here.
All right, so we'll give it another 4 minutes for the background.
Am I laying it on too thick if I'm worried about raised paint?
Probably, yeah. So yeah, all your layers should be still fairly thin. We're not caking on the paint, so to speak. So there's a saying in painting, fat over lean, right? So your initial layers will be much thinner than your subsequent layers after that. Your final layer, like when when you're just doing basic, little touch-ups here and there, that's when you're laying on your thickest paint, right? For any, like for highlights, you want to put like a thick, or fairly thick layer of white on something, or a little dab of a highlight. You want that to be, have some weight to it so it can reflect light more. In the beginning stages, we're still working with our layering and seeing how colors, when they're overlapped on each other, how they can really interplay, and what effects we can create at that point.
So quick
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of stripping, so I can fix that if I dry it and then go over it, right?
Yeah, so that means you're applying too many strokes to one area, right? So
Yeah.
use less strokes, put down the paint, and keep moving on. When you need to
Okay.
fix something, let it dry completely, because you can go over it later.
Okay.
But that in itself can be problematic too, because there's no real way to color mix exactly. You know, it's not that there's no way, but it's very difficult. So
Right.
I
I'm
would
going to
say
use
just
the,
lay it down, see what happens,
right.
let it ride for now, and then we'll move on to other stuff.
Okay.
So that goes more into the kind of mark making and having a little bit more intent on our mark makings. Rather than going over something 100 times, try to do it, 5 or less, and keep moving along, right? I know it might be hard because you're not too sure of the final product, right, or the final outcome. But sometimes it's better to just move on to avoid problems later on. All right, so I'm going to mix the shadow color here. So I was going to try to use a blue and just a little touch of black to see what that gets. And that gets us kind of like that Prussian blue I was telling about. So you can see here's my regular blue, that phthalo blue. I add a little bit of black, so I should still be able to see the blue. Now we can always add more layers afterwards to darken it if it's not quite as dark as it needs to be. For now, let's try that and see how it looks. So it's mostly blue with just a little hint of black to kind of get it to a murky blue. It should still look blue. It shouldn't look black. If it looks black, if it looks closer to black than it does to blue, you went too far. All right, so I'm going to lay that in underneath here. And when you put it on thinly, it appears to look green. That's okay. It's just going to require more layers later on. Now, my hope is if we do run out of time, that the simple construction of the painting, right, the simple composition will not be intimidating for you guys to, keep playing with the painting somewhat. Right, so I'm going to take you through 99% of the painting, but if we do run out of time, you will have a game plan, so to speak, to help you get through the rest of the painting on your own, which is, to me, that's the ultimate outcome of these sessions, is to give you guys enough confidence to try to paint on your own.
Sam, what are the two colors to make the shadow?
So it's just our blue.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm tapping a good amount of blue, fair amount, and then just a little corner's worth, right? I know it'll be hard to see on camera, but just a little corner of my brush, I'm introducing black a little at a time until we get just a darker blue, so to speak. What I was saying before is, like, if we add too much black, this new color that we're mixing is just going to look black. Now, I'm having a hard time lighting it, but it is on the bluer side of things. It's closer to the blue than it is to black. So right now it's just two colors for the shadow, blue and black.
I think we got a brighter blue. Does that mean we'll end up with more black in there?
Could be. Yeah, it should. If you look at the original painting that we're looking at, it is
I
a
see
very
some
dark
green
color.
in there too.
Some green. I would try to stay away from the green. We don't want any green to sneak in there. Oh, do you
Okay.
mean on your canvas?
No, on the original, the shadow appears a little bit blue-green.
It could, but for the most part, we're trying to keep it on the grayer side of things.
Okay.
And you can see how there isn't there's a soft edge to these shadows too. We'll be addressing that a little bit later, right? Because when you fill in the shadow, it's going to be one solid color. So when it meets that white color that you put on, it's going to be a pretty solid line. To get this soft edge, we'll have to add just a little bit white to that edge, but I don't want to do that just now. We can do that in a second layer when we pass over it. Okay. All right. How's everybody doing with the shadows? We're done with those? Still working?
Still working. Could you show yours?
Sure.
I'm finding it different from the original.
I think the only difference is this part over here, because we kind of invented that shadow. It's cut off in the original photo. Second, I'm going to try something here. Right. So we have to keep pressing on here. Okay, so we're going to start working on the apple slices, which is, it seems to be like the most complex portion of this, because there are so many different facets of the apples. All right, so if we look at the, I look for the brightest, and then I work my way down to the darkest. So the mid apple, we said, is facing the light source the most, it appears. So we have the palest yellow. So this is mostly white and just a little tinge of yellow. The second version would be this apple slice down here, right? So it has a little bit more yellow. It is white and yellow. It's just, it has a little bit more yellow than the initial slice, right? Then we have the one in the far background, which is kind of like a mustardy, kind of, murky yellow. And then here we have the darkest half, which is kind of like a brownish, orangey version, right? And then this one, it seems to kind of break the pattern where it has a very pale, almost, it looks very similar to the background. It almost looks like the same color here. So the color that we mix similarly for the background is what we're going to use for this backward slice here. I'm not sure what would make it this color. Maybe there's something else reflecting that's giving it a different light. But you can see, if you look at the 4 slices compared to that, it's a totally different color family. We have yellows and oranges, and then we have this cool grayish, bluish kind of color here. So we're going to follow that, right? We're going to try to be true to the painting. If it becomes problematic, maybe we'll have to change, we'll have to pivot a little bit, right? But for the most part, we're going to start with this bright yellow patch here, this yellow slice, move on to the second yellow, third yellow, and then last but not least, the orangey brown yellow. All right. Okay, so for color mixing, we're going to mix a nice pale yellow. So I'm going to pick up some yellow here. Now, yellow is a very weak color, so I can pick it up first. And then I'm going to grab some white. And I want it to be almost white. Like it's going to be really pale. If we have to make it darker later, that's fine. I'm out of white. I got to get more. All right, so there I have a nice pale yellow. Okay. And once you mix a color, if you're agonizing over whether or not it's the right one, there's only one way to find out, and that's just to put it down. All right, so another thing that differentiates beginner painters to more advanced painters is decision making. Just make the decision, put the shade down. If it's not the correct shade, that's okay. We'll adjust as we go. But one of the worst things that can happen is indecision and second guessing, and it'll just paralyze you, and your paintings won't progress as they should. Because I've gone into paintings and it feels like, I've heard the analogy, it's like walking through a forest in a fog. You know there's the other side of the forest. You don't know how you're going to get there. There's going to be all kinds of hazards in the way, and you're just going to work your way to it, and don't stop moving. If you stop moving, if you get paralyzed by indecision, you're never going to get to the other side, right? So it's the kind of same way with the painting. We're going to use our last decision to form our next decision, if that makes sense. I can't teach you stroke by stroke how to make a painting. I can only give you kind of like a basic roadmap. All right, so I got my next, I loaded my white again. So I'm going to make my next version of that yellow, and it should be slightly more yellow than our last one, right? So it may not seem like it, but this does have a little bit more yellow than my last version. I'm going to lay that down. So I didn't clean my brush. So this is, we're kind of like trying to use common sense here. If I'm using the same color, if I'm just using yellow by itself, yellow and white, I shouldn't have to clean my brush. I'm just going to mix color in a way that's kind of following the trend of the painting, right? So we have brightest, second brightest, third brightest. So I'm using the colors that I mixed here. It's the same colors. I'm just adding more yellow to this one. Don't have to clean my brush. I get to save some time and keep it moving. See, now this looks a little too equated to for this painting. So now this color informed me of my first decision. Maybe I didn't make it pale enough. So I'll go back at an appropriate time, and I'll add another layer on top to make it a little bit lighter than this version. I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to go on to my third slice because this is still drying. If I try to fix it now, I might just rip the paint off. I'll get a hot spot, and then that's a whole nother, a laundry list of things to do to fix it. So this apple slice in the upper left corner, let's take a look again at the material. So this is, like I said, is a mustardy yellow. So for mustardy yellow, let's try, we're going to add a little bit of green and maybe a little bit of red to the yellow. So now I'm going to clean my brush off right now. So I've been using the same brush for these two slices. I am going to clean it off because I think maybe the white might be problematic at first. So again, I'm a little unsure, but I'm making the decision. I'm riding with it. So I'm going to, with a clean brush, I'm going to pick up some yellow. Now, these apple slices aren't very big, so we don't need a huge amount of paint. I'm going to pick up just a corner of green, and that's going to make a greenish yellow color. Now, using the color wheel that I showed before, the way you neutralize green is adding a little bit of red. That's its complementary color. So I add just a little slice of red, And it should give me a mustardy kind of brown color. I'll add just a little bit more. I went a little too far. So now it looks more just brown. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow just to brighten it up just a little bit. Okay, now you can see how translucent it is. A lot of that gray is spilling through the color, and you can't really see the true nature of this color, but it is kind of a brownish yellow color. I'm going to put it on, see how it looks. All right. Now I took the white out because I thought maybe that might make it too opaque, but now it looks like a little opacity could have done us some good, because now it looks very, if you look at it now, my painting looks very wishy-washy. So while the paint is still wet, I'm going to add some white to it very quickly. Oops. So I'm going to take a little bit of white. I need it to be darker than the other slices. So it's going to need a fair amount of yellow. Okay, now you can see how the color is showing up a little bit better on my palette here. And I'll add that. So this paint is still wet. I'm just trying to mix in that opaque white into it. Okay, I think that's pretty close right now. Right, so that opacity did help. So it was just a little bit of white. If we try to cake on the white, it'll make that slice too light and it won't seem like it's in the background or it's, you know, slightly in shadow. If you put too much white, what I'm saying is it's going to equate it to these two slices here, which are actually facing the light. Anything faces the light is going to be brighter than something that's sitting in the shadows. Even though it's the same fruit, you know it's the same color. If you were to spin that apple into the light, those slices would be the same color. But the fact that it's in shadow, it's not receiving light, it's getting only bounced light, right? It's going to be much darker than the other slices. And that's what really pushes the illusion of lights and darks. You have to differentiate your light shapes from your shadow shapes and never confuse the two. Otherwise, it's going to flatten out the image. Right? You could already see the forms kind of turning in space. Once we add this red, you're really going to see the difference between those two forms. So we're using linear perspective, right? We did our lines. We have this slice appears thicker than this slice. So it automatically seems like there's like a peak there. Now we're using color or atmospheric perspective, right? To show the differentiation of those sides. So now for my orangey slice, that's our fourth darkest slice, right? So we have what appears to be a lot more red and green. Red and green will give us a brownish color, but we need the yellow to maintain some of that warmth, right? We want it to be related to the other slices. So that falls into the category of color harmony, right? When you're using similar colors, but in various amounts, right, to show lights and darks, they still will, since they're related, they appear to work together much better, right? My example of what not to do would be to, at this point, get an orange tube of paint to try to paint this. We didn't use orange to make any other color here. So it's going to look very different from our other colors. It's not going to be, you know, cohesive. So that falls into color harmony. All right, so to this puddle here, this is where I mix the third apple slice. I'm going to just add more red and a little bit more green. Red and green in the right amounts will give us a brownish color. Now, not to let it get too brown, let's add just a little bit of yellow. Now, yellow is a very light color, but you know, the translucency is so high that when we add it, it's not going to overpower and lighten it too much. If we added white to this, it would become something totally different. It would probably look more like peach. So I'm using yellow to lighten it somewhat, but yellow doesn't lighten so powerfully as white, right? All right, so I have my brownish color. Let's lay that in and let's see how that, so I needed it darker than that slice, right? That's what we were kind of shooting for. Okay, I'm making sure that I'm painting up to the pencil marks. I'm not leaving any gaps. Because trying to color match later on to fill in those gaps is very, very difficult. I think we're good with the apple slices. Next, we're going to work on the rind of the apple, right? Those reddish colors. For the most part, there seems to be just two different varying shades. We have a deep red and then a maroon color. The deep red would be the actual color of the rind, and then the maroon would be the shadowy portion of the rind, right? That's the portion that's turning away. So this is called the form shadow, right? Those dark tones that appear on the shapes of things, those are the form shadows. And then the shadows that are on the table or any other surface, those are called the cast shadow, the shadows being cast on the surface. The form shadow is actually on the figures themselves or the subjects, okay? So the form shadow here is a maroon color, and then the local color of the apple is this kind of deep red. All right, so the deep red, just so we don't have this jarring red color, right? We have this red right out of the tube. We're gonna tap some red. And then to decrease that red amount, we're gonna take a little bit of the blue, just a little corner, right? And when you mix that in, you should get a red that's slightly darker than the red out of the tube. Okay, so now if we wanted to add any accent marks with the red, we already have a brighter red. It's the red out of the tube. Those would be our accent marks. For the main color of the apple, we're going to use this deep red here. And all we did was just add just a little corner of blue. I touched the corner and I added it. If it starts to look too dark, too purple, add more red to it. Bring it back closer to red. So you can see it's just a shade darker than the red out of the tube. All right, and I'm going to paint my apples that color.
That was for the red. You took red and mixed in what for the darker?
Just a bit of blue.
Thank you.
Okay, so I did that first lane with the red with this brush, and it got a little too big for the smaller sections, right? Because there is a little bit of red peeking around the slices. So there's a little bit of red that follows along this edge here, gets into these corners here. If you look at the mid-ground apple, you can see how the red curves around the slice and up, up that edge there. There's red towards the stem. There's like a little halo of red there. So there's a lot of little places where red is very thin. So you're gonna just change your brush accordingly. So I know I can't successfully get my red in there with this big old honking brush, right? I mean, this is my medium brush. I did the sizes the areas that I could. Now I'm gonna switch to a smaller brush. So you could use a small flat, such as this. If you have a small flat brush, you can use the knife edge of that and just kind of paint sideways. Or if you have a very thin round brush, right? It's called round because that's the shape of the barrel, right? You could use also a thin round brush. So whichever one you're equipped with, and that'll help you get those edges. Okay, we'll keep on marching along. Now with that same brush, that same small brush, you could make a brown. And brown, like I said before, is red and green. So I'm just taking my small brush. I have my red and green mixture up here. Now, if it doesn't start to look brown, if I just get this murky kind of gray, what I can do is warm it up with yellow. And yellow will tend to make it look nice and warm it up, so to speak, right? So I had that grayish mixture between my green and my red. I mixed yellow in at the end. And now I have a kind of a nice warm brown here. Okay. Now I could add a little bit of white too, just so you guys can see. So you can see if you add some white to it, you get this really tan kind of color. This is good for the highlight on the stem. But that comes a little bit later. So right now I have my brown. So I have a kind of like a dark brown, medium brown, and a light brown or tan. We can use all the three of those shades. And all I did was I made my brown and then added white in different amounts to get my very light tan and medium brown. So from one color, I get three. And of course, you can add different amounts of white. You can get a whole gamut. You can get 10 different shades of that, but I think at this point, it's not necessary. So I'm going to do my stem. One solid shape. Okay, I'm also going to use that same brown for the seeds. And just like I did with the red, to make a deeper red, I added blue. You could do the same thing to brown. If you want to make a darker brown, I'm not going to mix it to the whole thing. So over here, I'm going to kind of reserve a section over here. I'm just going to pick a little bit of blue. Okay, it's just a tiny little drip. I'm going to put it here. Mix in a fair amount of the brown. Keep mixing. Okay, and you can start to see that you get a darker version of the blue. I'm going to put a little bit more. Now, if it starts to look too green, that means the yellow and the blue are really, dominating. The only way to neutralize that green would be to use red. All right, that's the complementary of green. And that'll warm it up and that'll get you back to brown. So if you really think about it, any mixture of color, right, to get a neutral color, it's just mixing different ratios of yellow, red, and blue, right? Because if you think of complementary colors, green and red, they're complementary colors on the color wheel. Green is just yellow and blue put together, right? So again, primaries. If you did purple and yellow, the complementary of yellow is purple, right? Right across from the color wheel. But purple is just red and blue. So again, the three primaries. If you did orange and blue, those are the complementary colors. So right across from blue would be orange. Orange is yellow and red. So again, yellow, red, blue. So it's always these three colors in different ratios will get you your neutral colors, different variations of neutral colors, and also your browns. The brown, it'll be more yellow and red, right, to keep that warm color, and just a little bit of blue. Then to get different variations of brown, you mess with those ratios. And white, of course, to get the lighter colors. So that's why it's really important to work with a limited palette in the beginning to really understand how colors work with each other. It also harmonizes your color because every mixture starts with these three colors. You're not getting 4 tubes of blue, 4 tubes of red, because those are mixtures within themselves. The companies have their own formulas to make those colors. So you don't know what kind of mix you're going to get if you're not, harmonizing them correctly. So that darker brown that I just made, I'm going to use for the shadow bits of the stem. So that's underneath the top portion there. And also I'm going to pick the left side both the top and the stem. So you can see how that already gives me a light and dark version of those two. I'm also going to take the dark brown and outline my seeds a little bit, just to give them more dimension. So I say outline, I'm going around the edges. The center is that brown color. And you can already see that gives it a lot more dimension. Right. I'm going to switch my brushes back to my medium brush. I'm going to do this leaf over here. And I'm just going to get my initial greens in, because we've covered pretty much almost everything of the canvas except the core, right? And this leaf. Everything else we've touched with some layer of paint. Okay, so I already have my green. I can make two different greens. All right, my first green is green from the tube. And then if I want to make a darker green, we know blue is a component of green. If I add more blue, it should make it a darker green. All right. If I wanted to make a lighter green, I could do two things. I can add white to make a pale green, right? Or I can add yellow to this green and make a more yellowish green. Okay, adding white to the green tends to neutralize it, like it gets rid of the green, right? It tends to make it look too pale. So the way we warm that up is by adding yellow. You could either add yellow by itself to the green to make a yellowish green, but that has a bit of translucency to it. If you need a solid light green, you can add white to it, which will give you a pale green, but it might be too pale, so you can add some yellow to warm that green back up. Okay. All right, so for the two greens, we're going to do a dark green first. All right, and I'm going to add it to the top leaf here. And for the bottom green, I'm going to take the tube green and add that. It's too similar. Okay, once you lay that in, I got my two greens separated. They look a little too similar right now. I'm gonna let it dry, because if I try to play with it right now, I'm just gonna rip that paint off. So we're gonna move to the core after that. Cores. Oh, you know what? I forgot to add the brown. So if you still have some of that brown, you should have some of that brown still there. I forgot to add it to, I wish I knew the name of that part of the apple. The part here, I guess it's where the flower used to be, right? The bottom of the apple. I'm just gonna add some brown paint there. Now, if it's a little light at first, that's okay, because the final paint version of the painting, it's much darker. We can add that to the second layer. But right now, that'll be a nice placeholder. You can always make it darker later. So let's talk about these neutrals that I've been harping on about. So I know for the most part, I've said that the green and the red kind of neutralize one another, but in different amounts you'll get browns. But I think I was adding the yellow to make it more brown. But if you just leave it green and blue, we're going to work with those two. And we're going to mix those up. You can see it makes like a murky kind of gray. So it still looks more like on the brown side, but in person, it looks very neutral. Now I could further neutralize this. Right, it's a little too warm. When things look warm, it's leaning more towards the reds and yellows. So if I need to bring this, make it a little bit more neutral, I can actually introduce just a little bit of blue. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do here. I had the green and the red, which the green in itself is kind of like a warm green. You might have more of a I guess a less warm green, a cooler green. You might have, I think they might even call it primary green. I'm not sure. But if, like I said, if you're mixing green and red and it still looks a little like it's leaning towards the warm side of things, you're going to introduce just a little bit of blue. And you're going to mix that up nice and good. Now we really have this grayish color. And I'm going to mix a little bit of white next to it just to show you how gray it is. Because you don't really, you can't really tell the nature of the gray until you add white to it. So if you look here, here's the color that I mixed. It's almost the same color as my background. This is a 50-50 gray, right? So I mixed green and red and I got this color. It was a little too warm for my taste, so I added just a drop of blue and then darkened it up even more. And then when I add white to it, that's where I get this really neutral kind of gray. Oh, my focus is going crazy. Okay, in business. Okay. So you really don't know the nature of the gray that you've created until you add just a little bit of white, and then you can really see that neutral. So the shortcut, right, you can still mix this color from using the primaries because we know that yellow and blue makes green. I started out with a green. So that's our shortcut. We use the green and red to make that murky kind of color. We add a little bit of blue to neutralize it even further, make it a little bit darker. And then when I added white, you can see it's that nice gray color. Now, if I had leaned towards the warmer colors, I would get my browns. Okay. So again, it's the ratios of these three colors that give you all the other range of colors. All right, so we're going to take these neutral colors and we're going to start working on the core of the apple. All right, so we're going to use the dark version for the more shadowy areas and the lighter version for the parts that are hit by color. So if we take this core right here, think of it like a bowl. And anytime a bowl is lit, right? So the light is coming from here and it's hitting this side of the paint, this side of the cup. So this part looks lit and the part closest to the light is actually in shadow. That's the bowl effect, right? So it's going to be the same thing here. If light is coming from here, light is going to hit this side of the core and this side of the core is going to be in shadow. Okay, let's give it a shot. So I'm going to take my darker version and I'm going to introduce some of that over here. And I'm also going to introduce some of that into the core over here. I don't have to cover it 100%. I'm actually letting some of that color kind of underneath show through. Okay. And now I'm going to move to the lighter side of things. And I'm going to add it to the left side. And it'll be much more obvious when they're kind of next to each other. If they're too similar, maybe brighten one up a little bit. Okay. You can see I'm not too worried about getting paint on my seeds. I can always add that brown later. And, you know, it might give me some fun stuff to look at later on when the colors are kind of overlapping. So just to go back to the finished painting, you can see how there's a lot of interplay of color here. So over here, we have this dark edge here, and then the lighter color moving in between, right? So let's start to lay down the darker version first. It's easier to lay the darker version in this case because the lighter version has a lot of white in it. And white, as we know, is opaque. So it'll just lay over whatever we put there first, right? If our lighter color did not have white in it, we might want to put that one first because you can't lay the lighter color without white on a darker color because it's see-through. Does everybody understand that? And that might be a hard concept to understand. So areas that are light that don't have white should be preserved. You don't want to let your darker colors there because if you put a lighter color that's translucent over a darker color, it's going to take on the dark properties of the paint underneath, and you're not going to see the light color. Okay? You'd be using the lightness of the canvas to make those lighter colors stand out. That's light colors without white. Light colors that do have white, you could put those on pretty much on anything because the white is opaque and it will cover like whiteout anything underneath it. So let's go to our darker neutral color. Let's start putting that in. And also, if you want to refer to your own the JPEG image that you were given, this would be a good time to refer to that because it's really hard to explain all these tiny little strokes that go here, there, and everywhere. Those are like the more difficult aspects of this kind of arrangement, this kind of teaching style. Okay, so again, on my painting palette, here are my 3 neutrals, right? So this is without white, this is with a little bit of white, and this is with a lot of white. So I have a range of 3 neutral values. These are, I started out with the green and red and a little bit of blue. This is my dark version. You add a little bit of white to that and you get this value. You add a bit more white and you'll get this much lighter value. So from one color, you get a range of 3 just by adding white to them in different ratios. Okay. All right. And now with my mark making, I'm looking where my brush should go, and I'm committing, and I put in my mark. I leave it be. All right. So in my head, I'm with intent. I'm looking at where I think I want it to go. I'm making a decision. I'm putting it down, and I'm letting it sit. I'll look at it. If I need to change it, I'll let it dry, and then I'll add to it later. Or if I want to change it right away, I'll have to do that immediately before the paint dries. All right, and next I'm going to look at the top apple. Let's see what colors. I think that was probably the most difficult one to explain because there's just so much. Yeah, you guys can see all this mark making. I would start with if you look at the paints here, I would start with the dark ones first because the white overlaps the dark because it's opaque. The darker is translucent, so it should go on first. And then with the white paint or the lighter versions of those neutral colors, you can layer them over top. Okay. Same thing here. It's very difficult to explain all these kind of paint strokes. The only thing I can give you is kind of like that rule of thumb where you start with the darker neutrals first, and then you overlap the lighter neutrals on top. You can see how they're very gray compared to our warm colors surrounding. We have orange, yellow, and red. These appear very gray. And same thing here, right? We have a little bit of a lighter tone here. This appears to be more on the greenish side. Maybe those neutrals are mixing with the yellow a little bit, giving us a green. But here you have a lot of opportunity to be creative and just kind of let the mark making, shine. So I'm actually using some of these neutrals to go over this part of the apple here. Put another layer of neutrals here. So you can see how this darkened up really fast. My first version was a little bit lighter. And I'm also using my neutral color, my dark neutral, to give me a little bit more of a profile edge on the outside of that apple. That's a little bit more fitting to the original. Let's see. You can see how in some areas, there's a very thin outline of dark paint. Now this could be black. It could be like that blue that I was telling you about, that Prussian blue. But I would caution using black or even doing it at this point. They're razor thin. And if we don't have a lot of control over our brush, these lines can get very thick very fast. So I really wouldn't advise going around the lighter sides with the dark colors, but sticking to, the edges that appear darker, that are not adjacent to any light shades is what I really mean. So just to make it easier on myself, I'm working in phases. So amongst the 3 apple slices, if I'm working on dark on one, I'll go to the other one and see where I can place in that color, right? Before I jump to the next value, right? Value is just the brightness of something. So I start with the dark value first, and I do all 3 shades, all 3 apple slices, I mean. Then I'll go to the middle value and I'll see where I can place that. I'm looking at the original and I'm looking at where I can place that middle value. And I'll go from each slice so I'm not cleaning off my brush and I can really utilize all that paint that I mixed. Then I'll go to the lighter version, and then I'll put that in sparingly, right? Because there's not a lot of really hot spots on these apple slices. You can see here along this edge, maybe to this edge here, but that's really similar to the apple slice. Yeah, so there's little swipes of light, very light color. So I think you guys might want to limit how much of that last value you're using, right? So the lighter the value, the less quantity you want to use. And I'm really just trying to have some fun and make some interesting marks here while getting the gist of what the original artist intended. Really, just having fun and placing marks. Like this is our interpretation of that painting. We're not trying to do it one for one like a photo reproduction. I'm going to go back into the seeds. I'm going to repaint my seeds because they are getting a little lost here. So the seeds, they have a little bit of a highlight on them. Maybe it went too bright. Let's see. Yeah, these seeds, they have a very light, highlight. These two seeds here don't have any highlight at all. You can see that they're surrounded by like a deep brown, and then they have a lighter, like neutral brown on top for those seeds. This seed here has just a little kiss, a little hint of a highlight there. You see that? So if you look at mine, I think I took a little too much liberty and I went a little crazy. Let's take a look. Yeah. I went too nuts with the highlights. So I'm going to knock those down a bit. So the brown that I made, I'm going to go over those highlights and cover them just a little bit. I think this one here is pretty much the only one that really shows it, and it's tiny. So I'm just going to knock these down. And the only one that really was kind of singing right there was that little guy there. All right. All right, so that's the that's pretty much our done. We're done with our second pass of this painting. Now the third pass would just be more of the same, okay, but to a lesser extent. We don't want to cover every single thing that we've done here. However, we do want to push the shadowy areas of the apple. We want to give the shadows another pass, possibly adding a little bit of white to the edge to feather it out. We don't want this deep line in between this. And the background could also use probably another layer of paint. I could probably push the shadowy like that. It's kind of, the effect is called vignetting. So towards the edges of a painting, you'll get darker paint. So you can see how at this corner, this paint here is much darker than this paint here. So you have that sinking into the shadowy shapes. And at the corners of the painting up here, they're pretty much bright. And as we come over here, they become more neutral and a little bit darker. All right, so the blue that we have might not be sufficient to get that quality. So that's why I was saying adding just a little bit of black could help us out, just to quiet down that brightness. All right, but something I did want to go over for sure was the leaf. So let's go back to the leaf. So I think that's probably one of the weakest parts of the painting right now. So let's get it up to speed. So now that we have this nice base layer and we have the, whatchamacallit, the, I don't know, the basic plan for the leaf, right? We have, the leaf is cut into two parts. The upper portion will be darker than the bottom portion and split by the, the vein of the leaf right down the center. So with a kind of like a medium-sized flat brush, I'm going to add another layer of green to the bottom. This is that tube green. Try to keep it simple. Now for that, remember I told you it had that spiky kind of edge? You can use the knife edge of the brush and you can kind of just add just the tiniest little hint of spike lines there, kind of like that. So I'm painting along the edge of that leaf using the knife edge. I'm cutting, spreading the paint around. I'm cutting again, spreading the paint around, cutting again. Right, so it's just this gentle little spike I'm creating and then backfilling it somewhat. And then the top portion of that leaf, we're using the same green from the tube and adding just a little bit more blue. So I'm using my tube green and then I'm adding just a little bit of blue to darken it up. And now I have my two greens there. And I'm going to darken that up. And I'm just trying to break up the edge of the top leaf somewhat. But you can see how it's very translucent. Since we're not adding any white to this. If it overlays the background, it looks a little bit translucent, but I think it'll pass for now. And to add some effect to that leaf, right, we want to add some of the veins. You can see how it's not just the dark green and mid green by themselves. So we're going to take a little bit of white to the green. All right. So this tube green, again, we're going to add some white to it. Well, you see how pale it gets? So white and translucent colors can get, it's a slippery slope sometimes. I'm going to add more green to that so it's just not so different. Now here we have that pale green. Now, if I put that pale green, I don't think that's what it calls for right now. So I'm going to take a little bit of yellow. Remember, yellow is a component of green. So I'm going to take a little bit of yellow. I'm going to add it to that green and it'll warm it up some. It'll give it us a nice warm green. It's still paler than the other green, but it's not quite as lifeless, right? The yellow kind of warms it up, kind of adds new life to it. Okay. And I'm just going to dab some paint in the center, which represents the main vein down the middle. And, I didn't just put one big swipe of paint. Like I want some texture in there. I want some playfulness, so to speak. So, second. Right, so you can see that there's some gaps in my line here. And then I'm going to do very soft lines from there. I'm just going to pretend like I know what I'm doing and put in some veins that offshoot from the main vein. Right, they're all kind of coming off at an angle. They're not coming straight down. They're going at a 45-degree angle, coming this way. Okay. And with that same green, I'm going to give just a hint of that green at the upper edge of that leaf. Okay, so on the top portion, there's a little bit of light green just kissing the edge of that leaf. So up here is what I'm talking about. I'm just going to touch just a little bit of that light green, not over the whole leaf, not over the whole top portion, just in this area here and maybe this area there. Okay. And with our last bit of time here, I'm actually going to take that opportunity to darken up the apples, because right now the apples look way too red. The reds there are just too bright, right? You can see how these apples, the rinds are much more maroon in the shadows. In the shadowy areas, you see how it's close to the shadow? There shouldn't be as much brightness there. But right now we do have a good underlying red value. So on this apple, you can see how there's maroon and red, right? The midground here, right? We can add another layer of that, the red that we have, and then add blue to that red and create a darker shadowy version. Paying attention to this curve here, because that'll help define the shape of the apple. Okay, and the same thing here with this apple in the foreground. The bottom part, any of the parts closer to the shadow, that's where your darker reds are going to appear. And as you move closer towards the light, you're going to get a lighter red. All right, so just make sure that you separate those two values of red. All right, so I'm going to take my red, I'm going to add a little bit of blue to it. And I'm going to lay in my next bit of red here. Now I'm going to let the red that we put there kind of be my bright red, so I don't have to cover that again. This will be my intermediary color between the really shadowy areas and the mid shadows. And now I'm going to add a bit more blue to a red to get me even a deeper maroon. Now with this final layer, You want to press lightly. You don't want to rip off any of the paint underneath. So a lot of those rough brush strokes that we started off in the beginning, we kind of have to pull back on and paint much lighter. This is where acrylic brushes really shine. For subsequent layers, they're very gentle. Natural fiber bristles are just notoriously stiff, and they could actually rip paint off that you don't want ripped off. So you have to be careful when you're using the brushes that you have. All right. So you can see the difference, right? This is super bright. There's no way this apple can be that brightly lit so close to the shadows. So I got to knock that down. And that actually looks like, since that's the only slice that we see from the absolute side, this can be the actual darkest red here out of all the apples, because the other apples, we really don't see the edge that's touching the shadow, except for this one. So this can like just bleed right into the shadow, almost be like a lost kind of edge. Right, so in painting, we talk of edges, right? We have a hard edge, so that would be like this right here. Right, we know that's clearly defined. That's a hard edge. Then you have a soft edge. So that's something that appears fuzzy, so that like maybe this part of the shadow, since it's moving away from the shape, we get a softer edge here. It's kind of feathered. And then you have a lost edge, an edge where it seems to blend so well into the background, you can't see where it ends and the background begins. And that's called a lost edge. And all throughout your painting career, your painting life, you will be playing with those different types of edges. I think I can go a little bit higher with that red in the back. So the only thing I did with the red to make it darker was add some blue to it. And for my shadowy areas, just to get rid of that green, because some of that yellow is shining through the shadows too much, I'm going to go back to my blue and black. I'm going to do another layer of that. And you can really see how much more solid that shadow shape looks with our second layer. I was never worried about this shadowy area because I knew the darker colors would overpower on the second pass. So right now it looks so dark that it looks black, but I assure you it is not. It's a very, very deep blue, bluish black. And I did say we were going to feather that outer edge. This would be the time to do that. Once you start addressing this shadow shape, I'm leaving a kind of like a buffer area. Let's see, maybe if I bring up the light. So, come on, focus. Okay, that's a little bit better. Okay, so this area is wet. I haven't painted over here just yet, right? So I've introduced the paint back to the shadow, but I'm not going all the way to this edge. This is the part that I'm going to use, the real estate I'm going to use to feather the shadow. So I've pretty much woken up these shadows again, meaning I've reactivated them. I put paint there, so now this place is live. It's not dead. Dead means dry. So I've the shadows now live. So I'm going to grab some white paint, a very small amount, okay, and I'm just going to introduce it along this edge and just feather it into the shadow areas. Now, if it looks too bright, that's okay, because I'm going to introduce that dark color again. Maybe that was too much white, went too far. All right, so back to the black and blue. So I cleaned off my brush, I grabbed just black and blue, no white. I'm going to use the white that's on the canvas, and I'm going to paint, I'm going to feather out that shadow shape. Now, if you think that went too far, right? Well, we said we were going to adjust the background some, and that would be the time you would cut back in with the any correction that you do to the background, you use to reshape the shadow. Because remember, the background has white, so the background can be used to correct any shadow shapes that you want. All right, so I'm gonna try to do this shape over here to feather that in. This is a bit tricky. So I would take your time. I'm just kind of speeding through it because we're pretty much out of time. So like I said, I want to set you up with a game plan that allows you to continue painting until you're satisfied with the result. You wouldn't be doing anything new. You would just be doing more of the same that we've discussed throughout the afternoon. Right, you guys have the original, so you guys can kind of play with what you have there. And this, I think we have a pretty solid foundation. Like I said, this painting is probably about 99% done. Things that you might want to check are the levels of the apple slices. So this one seems a little bit lighter, well, a lot lighter than the original version, right? You could push that. Same thing with this one here. We could push that a little bit darker. Our initial slices, they're pretty much on point, right? These guys here. The leaf, we could push the darks a little bit further. And then maybe when we do the background, make the edges at the lower portion a bit darker. So it seems like it's fading into darkness faster. Because this, on my painting, it is darker than the top, just not by much, right? I feel like there's a more dynamic range here. Right, it gets a little bit darker than it does at the top. Well, overall, I think we discussed how to get the neutrals pretty well, and they're playing pretty much in the middle of the core there. Oh, you know what? I don't think we painted this. Yikes. I forgot this slice here. Okay, so this slice is very similar to the background. So we're going to take a little bit of white. So I'm going to mix real quick. Some white here, a little touch of blue, and just a little touch of black. And we're going to put that on there, just see what happens, because that, for some reason, that's the color that the original has, right? You see how it's very similar to the background? So we're just going to, I guess, visually, it's picking up the color from the background. Well, we'll say the artist who painted this originally, there must have been a lot of bounce light from something with very cool light source. So I'm going to lay that here. I was wondering why this slice looks a little too warm. Now, when we first put that in, it looks very flat. So this is actually, this is the slice that I wanted to talk about mark making the most. Because the original does have a lot of character here. You can see how, especially, you can see this one swath right here, this almost like a rectangle. You can almost see the brush starting at the edge, and he's pulling from left to right to finish the stroke right here. Okay, up here, you can see the directions of the stroke, and you can see how they're all different colors. Why can I get to the top? Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit further. So you can see how the paint, it's not overly mixed. It's not one solid color, right? And that's kind of like the joys of this loose type of painting. You let the paints kind of play. You put in a mark, you let it sit, you put in the next marks around it, and you get to see how they work together. If you don't like it, let it dry and try something else. But for the most part, you have a blueprint of what should be there. So this time, I'm not going to mix my paints all the way. So I have my white, blue, and black, but they're not mixed homogeneously, right? They're not mixed evenly. It's not one solid color. And I'm going to lay in some strokes. Let's see, that's too dark. Let's see where the dark strokes were. Right, so the dark strokes are pretty much kind of towards the top and the middle and the edge of this area. And there's a light stroke down here. Maybe light is catching this back edge, and that's why he put the lighter stroke there. So let's do that instead. So dark here towards the edge and maybe up here. Now I'm just going to add white, and I'll add it here. Here. And I'll knock this down some because it looks way too bright. All my strokes are at an angle, kind of following the geometry of the slice. Then I'm going to add some red to that edge because I feel like the white spilled over into my apple area. Kind of like so. We're going to add a little bit of red to this edge here. Very thin. All right. So you can see how it adds some visual interest. So the apple slices, they are all varied, but this one is just like really different from the others. Yeah, so my next move would be from my perspective on my painting, I would use the background. I would do another pass of the background because we only did one pass after the underpainting. So we did the yellow underpainting, we did the background, and then we went into the rest. the background could use another covering light at the top, and it gradually gets darker towards the bottom. And you can use the photo that was provided to kind of double check back and forth what you guys want to adjust. All right, and that's pretty much I have all for today. It's 13 past 4, so we are out of time. But you can see how just a simple painting like this, just a simple still life, there's a lot of stuff that you can learn from doing something simple and straightforward. And you can definitely set something up like this in your house. You could take slices of orange, you could take a pear, you could take, a banana, lots of different things, and use color creatively and just have fun with mark making.
This has been a wonderful class. Thank you so much.
Excellent. You're most welcome.
Learned a tremendous amount.
Excellent.
Yeah, your narration was really great.
Awesome. All right. I'm getting goosebumps over here. I'm doing all right. All right. I mean, it's so hard. I like to be in person. I like to talk to people and show things in person, but I guess this is the next best thing, and I'm glad it's working out.
It definitely is working out. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thanks again, Sharisa, for hosting and Hoboken Library. I'm very, very grateful. I get to share this stuff.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Right. Take care. I'll see you guys next time.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the weekend. Bye.
You too. Bye, Sharisa.
Bye,
Bye.
Charissa.
Yeah.